Okay. And all the past presentations, and this as well, are posted on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch this presentation again, just go to YouTube and Google Jilliane Lyon, and it'll come up. Or if you want the link, I put my email in the chat, and I'd be happy to send the link directly to anybody who would ask me for it. So let's ask the prayers today on All Saints' Day of all the eco-justice saints. Francis of Assisi, Hildegard of Bingen, Dorothy Stang, Berta Cáceres. And to lead us in prayer to begin our session, I'll invite, as I said, a member of our Dorothy Calvani, to lead us in our opening prayer.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you all for being here. And it's a great honor. And I'm going to do the prayer in sort of three little parts. The first part is kind of a chant, which I'll invite you to breathe with the chant. The second part is a little guided prayer. And the last is kind of the Holy Spirit, the great divine spirit prayer for you and for me. So we'll begin with the chant. In breath, out breath, deep breath, slow breath, calm breath, ease breath, smile breath, release. Present moment, wonderful moment. In breath, out breath, deep breath, slow breath, calm breath, ease breath, smile breath, release. Present moment, wonderful moment. So I invite you to think about what surrounds you in this present moment. Your computer, your phone, your chair, your table, art, your clothes, your books, your home. And I would like you to think about what you may have enjoyed for breakfast. Perhaps coffee, milk, tea, sugar, eggs, oatmeal. And consider who provided them for you. Consider all the workers involved. Mother Earth, her sun, water, air, and soil, her land and water protectors, the pollinators, and all tiny life and microscopic life, trees, farmers, persons in the fields, craftspeople, miners, carpenters, artists, factory workers, animals, supermarket employees, delivery people on bikes and in trucks and vans and cars. It's an endless list. Now consider all this work and how it completely supports us in every aspect of our lives. How it nourishes us, shelters us, keeps us warm and cool, delights us, blesses us with laughter and inspiration and awe. And how greedy misuse of Earth's work and her workers puts Earth and all life at risk, especially the most vulnerable. So for a moment, I ask you to hold both gratitude and grief for these endless gifts of work that surround us. And so we hear the Spirit's prayer for you. Root your economy in solidarity. Help support and design an environment where earning, spending, borrowing, investing, and saving contribute to all Earth's flourishing. Continue to stand by the peoples, the workers, the humble, and struggle together with them so that true Earth-human mutual enhancement becomes a reality. Dream together. Find my dream together. And find out together how to move forward with creative alternatives for the common good in your common home. And thank you for living your lives in confirmation that your well-being is bound up with that of the well-being of all existence. For building bridges of love so that the voices from the periphery, both their weeping and joyful singing, provoke mutual respect and empathy in others. For listening to the cries of the earth and those made poor by injustice and inequality, and for acting on their behalves. Keep it up. You are my treasures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. That was a great prayer for our entering into this time of trying to understand ecological economics. Thank you, thank you. So I'm going to ask people to keep that sense of what Dorothy was sharing with us through this prayer, and perhaps how the Spirit spoke to you. I'm going to introduce Jilliane. So I'm very happy to welcome you, Jilliane Lyon, as the presenter for today's webinar on the third Laudato Si goal, ecological economics. And when Terry and I were thinking of a presenter to help us explore ecological economics and its meaning and ways it might be lived, we may live it personally and communally, Jilliane came to mind. I got to know Jilliane just over a year ago when we planned a Season of Creation Zoom event that was co-sponsored by ROAR, the Sisters of Charity of New York, and Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement. But before I formally welcome Jilliane, I would like to say just a few words about this third Laudato Si goal. And if you are like me, the term itself is a little intimidating. So I went to the Laudato Si Action Platform website to see what it says about this goal. We know that ecological economics, both words are derived from the Greek word oikos, which means house or household. And interestingly, the first sentence on the website read, ecological economics acknowledges that the economy is a subsystem of human society, which itself is embedded within the biosphere, within our common home. Aha. So human society, economics is a subsystem of human society, and it's within this biosphere within which we live. So I couldn't help but think both of Laudato Si and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because both of those things emphasize very much the interconnectedness between the social, the environmental, and the economic areas of our lives, and how we need to think and act out of this interconnectedness and interdependence, that we cannot address the economy, the social fabric within which we live, our environment. We cannot address these areas separately. We have to see them as an integral whole and address them as such. And then the definition of this Laudato Si goal goes on to say it includes actions that are sustainable production and consumption, ethical investments, divestments from fossil fuels, and any activity harmful to the planet and the people. It supports circular economies and prioritizes care labor and protects the dignity of workers. So Jilliane, it is a privilege to have you with us as you help us delve into some of these aspects. Jilliane is a senior program associate at Investor Advocates for Social Justice, a nonprofit that represents faith-based investors who seek to leverage their investments to advance human rights, climate justice, racial equity, and the common good. And I'd like to just mention here that several of us who are on this call are members of congregations who belong to IASJ. So we're happy to have them with us. And many of them are really active participants that are on this call. So Jilliane leads a shareholder advocacy campaign inspired by Laudato Si called Climate Plus Dignity, which encourages corporations to improve their practices around climate and environmental justice. IASJ also leads interconnected campaigns on human rights in supply chains, racial equity, and peace and demilitarization. So Jilliane, we welcome you to help us explore ways we and faith-based investors can use our power, our resources, our voices, and advocacy to bring about an ecological economics that puts the planet, humans, and non-humans before profit. So thank you very much as you help lead us a little bit along the journey towards conversion and transformation on this goal. Thank you, Jilliane.
Thank you so much, Sister Carol. It is truly an honor to be here. I'm really excited. I'm gonna pop up a few slides real quick. So Father Terry, if you could make me the host for a moment.
I just tried. It says multiple participants can share screen. So see if that's possible.
Great.
And if not, I'll make you the host.
Yes, I think I am able to share my screen.
There we go.
Let's present. Can you
Excellent.
all see the slides? Great.
Yes.
Okay. Oop, went forward a bit there. So again, hello everyone. I'm truly honored to be here. I know this community is so dedicated to peace and justice work. I see a lot of familiar faces, so I know I'm in good company. Again, my name is Jilliane Lyon. I'm a senior program associate at Investor Advocates for Social Justice. And before I jump into my presentation, I kind of wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. I'm calling in from Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C., which is Piscataway land, a peoples who have lived here for thousands of years, continue to live here, and serve as stewards of the land. So I think land acknowledgements are very important, especially as I start talking about ecological economics. So in the next half hour or so, I will give you a background on the advocacy work that my organization, IASJ, does in the financial sector, the campaigns that I help lead inspired by Laudato Si that really show the intersection of climate justice and finance. And then I'm going to finish with some personal remarks. So without further ado, I will start us off with some mechanics. What is IASJ and what kind of work do we do? As Sister Carol mentioned, we're a nonprofit. We represent faith-based institutional investors. We represent really a community of these investors like Sister Carol's institution, and we collectively use those investments that serve to help people retire and keep mission work going, and we'll use those to advocate for a better economy. So as you can see on this slide, our vision is really to see an equitable economy that works for everyone. We believe this is possible, and we're trying to leverage financial tools to get there. We work to activate social justice through investment. We collaborate with those who are the most marginalized in our economy and try to do this work leading with integrity. So a little bit more background. IASJ was founded in 1975 by Catholic congregations involved in the movement to encourage corporations to leave apartheid South Africa. We were formerly known as TriCry, which you may have worked with us or known us under, but we transitioned to IASJ in 2019. And as many of you know, faith-based institutions have a very proud and long history as leaders of activating their investments to promote social good, looking at where money is invested, and then engaging companies around impacts of their business. So our organization was really founded from this advocacy movement to use financial resources more actively, and then it's really built on the extraordinary leadership of women religious. We have worked for decades alongside other coalitions of faith-based investors on issues like climate change and human rights. What exactly does this work entail? I think as Sister Carol mentioned, even the term ecological economics, these two big topics that sometimes don't seem interconnected, how do they relate? How can we use finance to advance equity, and in this case, climate equity? Shareholder advocacy is a broad term that encompasses a variety of strategies that responsible investors can use to engage with companies that they invest in about a myriad of environmental, social, and corporate governance issues. So just as an example of the kinds of things we do as part of this work, we will hold dialogues with corporate executives where we'll raise human rights concerns. We file documents called shareholder proposals with companies that will ask them to take a certain action, such as reducing their greenhouse gas emissions or reporting on their human rights impacts. And these are voted on every year by all the company's investors. We also go to those company annual meetings and we will raise questions, or we can lend our tickets to those meetings to impacted stakeholders so they can speak publicly about concerns. We also write investor letters to publicly or collectively express concern. We'll engage with public policy on this issue. We help our affiliate members advance mission-aligned investing principles, such as if they want to divest from fossil fuels, better align what companies they're invested in with their mission. And we do this work in partnership with impacted stakeholders. So all of that is to say that we are really working at the intersection of justice and finance. But I know many of you on this call may not be directly involved in investment or belong to an institution that is doing shareholder advocacy. However, we are all participants in the economy. Most of us are actually investors, whether we know it or not, through our retirement funds, our churches, even our state treasurers. So collective action is a very powerful strategy. There are many different groups that organize and advocate around these issues. For example, we're part of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, which is a large coalition, and there are many other networks and religious groups that pool their investments to do advocacy work. We also work side by side with advocacy groups to use investor leverage to bolster those public campaigns. In preparation for this conversation, Sister Carol mentioned to me that many people would be interested in learning what they can do around ecological economics. Our world economy is such an enormous system. I am personally a big believer in collective action. I will definitely touch on this more in my personal comments at the end, but engaging in strategies like shareholder advocacy that require pooling together resources and working alongside advocacy movements, I feel are so impactful. So I am now going to share a bit about IASJ's work with these strategies and go into a bit of a deep dive on our climate justice work. Just as an overview, IASJ has 4 major shareholder advocacy campaigns. The first is Shifting Gears, which focuses on the automotive industry and human rights in the supply chain. This has included engaging with companies on human rights risks, such as child labor in the supply chain of electric vehicle batteries through cobalt mining. Another campaign is Climate Indignity, which I'll be focusing on today, to really get companies to transition to a net zero economy in a way that prioritizes respect for human rights. Another campaign that we have is on racial equity and immigrants' rights. This responds to threats to civil rights and focuses on companies whose services or operations further systemic racism. I would say broadly, IASJ takes a racial equity lens across all of its campaigns. And as you can see, most of this work is very interrelated. Our last campaign is on peace and demilitarization, focusing on defense contractors and financiers to address risks associated with weapons, conflict, and other business practices that further human rights harms. And all of this brings us finally to our Climate Indignity initiative. It is inspired by Laudato Si, which encourages a holistic approach to addressing climate change that prioritizes justice. And this quote up here, I think, is really so inspirational and a foundation for this work. And it says, the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. So this is ecological economics, which for me embodies the way our systems of oppression and extraction are all very interconnected. We cannot address climate change without addressing the systemic inequalities in our economy, our governments, and society. So the biggest link between corporations and climate change that we've really pulled out in this advocacy work includes the connection to racial equity and environmental racism. In the US, as you can imagine, the link goes all the way back to colonization and the arrival of slavery. Environmental racism has always been baked into our nation's history, unfairly burdening BIPOC communities. And by that, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So today, I think we can all see this manifest in who has higher exposure to air and water pollution, and then higher health risks from that pollution. In the US, studies have found that air pollution is disproportionately caused by white Americans' consumption of goods and services, but is disproportionately inhaled by Black and Brown Americans. I think even recently we saw BIPOC communities face extremely high death rates from COVID, particularly in heavily polluted zip codes. So I think it is very clear systemically that environmental regulations do not protect our most marginalized communities. And all of this is so inherently linked to climate change. A recent EPA report has said that BIPOC communities will bear the disproportionate burdens of climate impacts in the US. That includes more deaths from extreme heat and property loss from sea level rise and flooding. We watched Hurricane Ida kind of confirm this. We saw Black and low income residents in Louisiana and Mississippi really left without the resources to rebuild from storm damage. I think Hurricane Katrina is an example that everybody remembers and can think back to and may have experienced themselves. It's such a stark example of the intersection of race, economic status, and climate disasters. The storm hit Black Americans in low-income communities the hardest due to redlining and housing segregation that pushes people into low-lying areas prone to flooding. And then race was also a factor in slow emergency response. So I think empirically and also data clearly links equity to climate change. They are two sides of one coin. And companies play an instrumental part in this. You may have seen that just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. So that is really a huge piece of the problem. This is why at IASJ, we have focused our efforts on companies' impacts to climate and human rights. I think there is this faith-based tradition to ensure that equity is the driving force of all the advocacy work we do. So that is really at the heart and spirit of this initiative. The goals of the campaign are twofold: to get companies to meet their human rights expectations and also their climate responsibilities simultaneously. And those expectations for companies are based on robust analysis of both UN climate science and business and human rights principles. We selected 8 companies in 4 different sectors based on what our affiliate investors were holding in their portfolios, and also looking at the company's outsized impacts onto the climate and marginalized communities. So really targeting some of the largest and most influential companies in our economy. After we selected our goals and our focus companies, we launched the initiative in October 2020 by sending letters to those 8 companies, listing our concerns and requesting dialogue with company executives. As you might be able to see from the company list, we have purposefully pivoted away from engaging fossil fuel companies, A, because many people are already divesting, and also B, the industry really hasn't changed after decades of advocacy and engagement. So a lot of these companies in chemical manufacturing and utilities and mining, they're very adjacent to the fossil fuel industry, still very critical to the climate crisis and climate solutions as we move forward. On this slide, you will see a map that we put together that outlines some of the very specific concerns we have been tracking related to these 8 companies. And we use these to determine if companies' practices are improving on climate-related human rights. We also have an international map with global impacts from our 8 focus companies. But as an example, you can see on this map, Southern, the large US utility, has a coal plant in Mobile County, Alabama. The surrounding community is largely comprised of people of color, and health impacts from air pollution are felt up to 25 miles away from the plant. Communities surrounding the facility claim that the company has not significantly improved its environmental protections, and health outcomes for the impacted residents really have not changed. And I think, unfortunately, there are similar stories all over the country. A 2015 study indicated that companies will choose to site their hazardous facilities in BIPOC communities, often because they serve as the path of least resistance. There may be weaker environmental regulations in those communities, lower funding for environmental protection and regulation. And due to discrimination, communities may lack the political clout and resources to oppose unwanted new facilities. So there are many socioeconomic and political factors at play, all entwined with systemic racism, but the result is pretty consistent across the country. BIPOC communities are bearing the brunt of industries that fuel climate change, and in turn, that puts them on the front lines of climate impacts. And that brings us now to where the work really hits the road. I'm going to walk you through a case study on Dow, the chemical company, a plant that they have in Cancer Alley. If you are not familiar with Cancer Alley, or it's also known as Plantation Country, it's a stretch of land in Louisiana that has a significantly high concentration of petrochemical plants and has some of the highest cancer rates in the country. The UN has called out the environmental racism in Cancer Alley, calling for the US government to protect residents here and for companies operating there to conduct human rights impact assessments. If you have read some of the stories of people living in this community, it really is heartbreaking. The UN has said in its statements, the African American descendants of the enslaved people who once worked the land are today the primary victims of deadly environmental pollution that these petrochemical plants in their neighborhoods have caused. So there really is this legacy of slavery tied to today, this environmental racism that is impacting people's livelihoods, their dignity, and really their right to life. So we started with a letter to Dow in October 2020, outlining our concerns and requesting to speak to company management. We have spoken with the company where we asked questions about their human rights policies and frameworks, how it applies to their operations in BIPOC communities, and how they're remediating impacts. Across the campaign, we asked companies, how are they meeting their human rights responsibilities? How are they meeting their climate responsibilities? And we often hear from companies that they are meeting all local and federal regulations and requirements. They operate to the highest standard. They are operating the same across all their facilities, which is a red flag to us, since if you are emitting the same kinds of pollution levels in Cancer Alley, then you are in the middle of the desert or in a really non-populous area, that has significant and disparate impacts. If we don't feel that a company is making enough progress or adequately responding to these concerns, we might file a shareholder proposal, which I mentioned earlier, are documents that are regulated by the Security and Exchange Commission and the federal government, where investors will ask the company to take a certain action and investors will vote on it. So it gets the company's attention for sure, and it is public. So we've had a lot of success using shareholder proposals to prompt company action, particularly on undergoing racial equity audits, conducting human rights impact assessments, and pulling out of funding for projects that present risks to human rights. So to me, ecological economics is the key to climate solutions, ensuring that we're looking at issues with an intersectional lens. I think the issue that we have faced in the past is that a lot of mainstream climate movements in the US have taken a kind of colorblind approach that can cause harm. And a study that I always cite is that pollution levels have decreased nationally over the past 30 years, but they actually have remained stagnant in the most heavily polluted neighborhoods. So in many ways, we've deepened the climate inequities. I think there are a number of things that we have to look for when we're doing climate work to ensure that even if we support it in theory, it's not deployed in a way that can further systemic racism and discrimination. So in this work with companies, sometimes it's not only if a company is meeting its climate goals, but how. A few examples of things that we look at when analyzing a company's climate targets and plans are like net zero climate targets that rely on natural gas and carbon capture and storage. That is really a racial justice issue. Carbon capture and storage is a technology that is still emerging, but the essence of it is that even if companies are emitting carbon into the atmosphere, it will kind of contain it, suck it back up. I am not an expert on this kind of technology, but that is the essence. But this still does not eliminate or reduce many impacts of fossil fuel extraction, transportation, and processing that will unfairly burden BIPOC communities. We hear a narrative from companies and industry leaders that natural gas is a solution for cheap, accessible energy for those without. It provides jobs for low-income communities. We have also heard that it is racist to oppose natural gas because it is such a good resource to communities of color, which obviously is a false narrative. Clean energy is a human right. I have said this so many times in our work, like impacts from natural gas are very serious. They include risks like cancer, decreased lung function, asthma, nervous system damage. Clean energy is a human right for everyone. Another thing that we've looked at is cap and trade policies, basically policies where some companies can buy and trade pollution. The way that it's carried out tends to consistently allow companies to emit more pollution in overburdened communities if they pay for it. if they kind of buy those pollution credits. So environmental justice advocates in California have really opposed this legislation for this very reason. Another thing we look at is matching companies' emissions reduction targets and their climate plans to place-based details. Where are they continuing to build out natural gas infrastructure? It's likely in BIPOC communities. Even if it's not targeted to very specific areas, like projects like pipelines will pass through extremely vulnerable areas, both due to socioeconomic structures and climate factors. So we really are honing in on what are the impacts to communities, what's the impacts to people's livelihoods. I think a last thing that we look for is like, who is going to reap the benefits of renewable energy? Where are those investments being made? Making sure that climate solutions aren't violating land rights, specifically the rights of Indigenous peoples, is very critical in this work, because renewable energy is such a big part of our climate solutions. But climate change in the US is rooted in theft of land from Indigenous peoples. So it would not make any sense that those climate solutions would continue to violate the rights of Indigenous peoples. Reports have shown a pretty widespread lack of respect for free, prior, and informed consent, a right that Indigenous peoples have to either consent or refuse projects taking place on their land or affecting their communities. So these are just a few examples of what our work is focusing on, what investor concerns around climate equity looks like, and our approach to having companies meet their climate and human rights responsibilities simultaneously. Again, they're really two sides of the same coin. And if you're only looking at one side of the coin, it's often at the expense of the other one. So looking purely at climate factors can often be at the expense of equity. That was some background on kind of what the initiative is, what the work looks like, but I wanted to mention also one of our organizational values, which is leading with integrity. I've talked a lot about the issue at hand, highlighting how the economy can be extractive and perpetuate harm, but we are still participating in this system and using these tools to advocate for justice. So this means that we need to do this work with a heavy dose of humility. I know I approach this work with a heavy dose of humility. It really looks like making sure that we do climate justice with accountability to those on the front lines of impacts, those with the most at stake. So IESJ as an organization is committed to doing the work in alignment, centering equity and community perspectives in company engagements. And a few kind of examples of what that collaboration looks like in our work is bringing communities' experiences or concerns directly to company management, encouraging companies to meet with community groups who have a concern, or if appropriate, really making it a condition of engagement, so showing true solidarity. We provide proxies, so those kind of tickets to companies' annual meetings, so individuals can attend and ask questions. We also bring our investor leverage to public campaigns. And I would say that in full transparency, again, a heavy dose of humility, we are not there yet on this commitment for the Climate and Dignity Initiative. We've definitely had a lot of success in some of our other shareholder advocacy, focusing on workers' rights, on demilitarization and tech issues, but it's really been a challenge for environmental justice, and we're still working towards building those trusting and accountable relationships. A big reason for this is a good reason. A lot of stakeholders do not trust investors. Our economy has done a lot of harm to communities, and building trust with partners is a very slow and intentional process. So this requires us reorienting the way that we do work. One thing we have found, though, is that intermediaries like working groups and advocacy networks can really help kind of start building trust and identify the right partners. So we're members of groups like the Investors and Indigenous Peoples Working Group, which really sets up the foundation for us to do this work in an accountable way. So that is a look at the work we are doing at IASJ, but I wanted to pivot now to touch on some personal comments that are the thoughts of me, Jilliane, and not necessarily IASJ, though there is definitely alignment there. So just on a personal note, I am a young person, and as a young person, I'm deeply disturbed by the climate crisis. For my entire life, the existence of climate change has been known and thoroughly documented. I think back, my elementary school play was about global warming, so I have really only ever known a climate in crisis. And growing up, it was always very frustrating to watch adults consistently stall and refuse to commit to real change. But through this work and engaging with companies, I've really realized how much this crisis is not the fault of individuals. Big fossil fuel companies have spent billions of dollars on climate denial and convincing consumers that it is our responsibility to fix climate change with our everyday choices. So you may be familiar that BP, the British petroleum company, popularized the individual carbon footprint to do just this, take the blame off of institutions who are responsible for the vast majority of the world's emissions and convince people that climate change is kind of our fault because we can't afford to buy electric vehicles or install solar panels. So what I really believe is our best bet for ecological economics that really work for everyone and serve equity and justice, it's not necessarily individual sustainable choices, though those are definitely very important. The best thing we can do is vote and advocate for better climate policy that also regulates companies. So I touched on this earlier, but collective financial action is so important. As participants in the economy, we need to use our institutional and collective voice to really demand that companies change their core business practices that led to the climate crisis in the first place. My friends and family who know that I do this work and engage with companies, they'll often ask, like, which are the bad companies? Which companies should I boycott or not buy from? And my answer to them is that it's not necessarily individual companies working as bad actors in our system. It's a bad system that is fueled by extraction. I mean, definitely there are some bad actors that I could point out there, but a lot of the companies we engage were founded from generational wealth acquired by slavery. So this is really built into how our economy was founded. And environmental justice and youth climate movements, what they're asking for is system change. Let's make it so it isn't easy and profitable for companies to pollute in BIPOC communities. Let's have better protections for workers and incentivize investments in clean energy. And very importantly, I would love to see it be mandatory for companies to meet their human rights responsibilities. And all of that is to say that climate justice is racial justice, is economic justice. Ecological economics recognizes that all systems should work to care for our common home and care for the people who live in it. So thank you for your time. I'm truly honored to be here with you all, even if it is in this virtual environment. I'm interested to hear if people have takeaways from this presentation, if you wanted to share your thoughts, how this connects to your work, or had any questions. So I'm happy to open it up for discussion.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Jilliane. What I'd like to invite us to do now, Jilliane, and yes, we're going to open it up for discussion. I'd like us, though, to first take a moment. You've enriched us very much. You've shared with us some very concrete ways in which IASJ is working in terms of this ecological economics. And I felt your personal reflections were just very, very valuable. So I'd like to invite all of us to just take a moment to take in what Jilliane said, kind of see what spoke to you, what kind of stood out, maybe where you felt moved, new insight. Just take a moment for that. And of course, one of the things we're trying to do in this series as we move through each Laudato Si goal is we're asking ourselves, what call did I hear? What call did I hear that moves us further along this path of ecological conversion? And when we share the I's, we also move closer to the we. What is this path that we can take towards ecological conversion? So let's just take a moment to just be quiet, and what did we hear, and then what would we like to share? So I'm going to ask both Terry and Jilliane to help me notice who might be wanting to say something. Feel free if you wish to say something in the chat, but also if you know how to use the hand raising thing, we'll recognize that much easier. But I'll also try to go through the screens to see if there's anyone who doesn't know how to raise their hand via Zoom, but is raising their hand through the picture. So just invite whoever would like to begin. And certainly questions are important too. Questions help us sometimes get to know what, raise another question, and also then brings us to some clarity and ideas. Aha, Catherine, I see that Catherine, and then I'm not too sure who is impero@gmail.com, but Catherine, Darcy, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you. And that was a great presentation. I'm new to this discussion in more intensity than I've been most recently. And so my question is around the divestment. The sense I picked up was that it's really there hasn't been a lot of movement in the fossil fuel, and that institutions and congregations of sisters are divesting. Is there any sense in keeping enough investment to have, say, one vote for the shareholder meetings, or has that proved futile and the recommendation would be to divest completely?
Thanks, Catherine. I think that's a great question. And I think it points to how stagnant the fossil fuel industry really has been, but also to the promise and success of shareholder advocacy actually holding a few shares to engage. So ISJ, we don't make financial recommendations of whether you should or shouldn't divest. I think that there's a lot of power and value in divesting from an industry that has caused so much harm. And 2050 is this deadline for being able to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is coming up very fast, and they're not changing their tune. At the same time, we have seen some amazing shifts in these companies. I don't know if anyone followed the ExxonMobil Engine 1 director votes, where basically an outside group selected board members with climate expertise and shareholders voted them onto the board. So even though I think divestment is a powerful statement, there is something to be said for being witness to people asking for change, really calling on these companies to change their core practices. So I don't have a very clear answer for you. I find value in both strategies.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I just want to call attention to the chat box before the other person. Sorry, I don't know your name, but I'll call on you in a second. But just note, Jilliane, you'll notice that someone did make the comment that Tonawanda is located in Western New York, not the capital, near the capital. But also there's a question, and I'm wondering if you can lead us to it. Where would we find IASJ's global map of company impacts? I think that was part of your slides. And there might be a way we can also get a set of your slides too. Maybe we can do that. But where would, if you can put that in the chat, where we could
Yeah,
find
I'll link it in the chat.
Okay, great. And I noticed Frank McCann, for those of you that follow chat, thank you, Frank. You gave us a YouTube to Jeffrey Sachs, YouTube on Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you. So hello there. Yes, you please unmute yourself.
IHM Peru. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm IHM Peru. Could you, yes, could you unmute yourself? I don't know if you can, Terry. Okay, good, okay.
No, you're still muted.
Okay, there you
She
go.
has to unmute herself.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, good, you got it. Hello.
I'm Sister Ancilla. I'm an IHM in Peru, from Scranton. And I have a question for
Welcome.
Jillian. At the end, Jillian, you mentioned just briefly that a bigger problem, or maybe a big problem, is systemic change. I understand, I think a lot of us understand that different companies are just resisting and they're the major polluters, but could you say a little bit about systemic change?
Sure, thank you. I think I view systemic change as a change to the economic system. As I touched on before, our economy and how it was founded in this country is really rooted in extractivism and exploitation. So when a lot of these movements are calling for system change, it's really calling for an upheaval of how our economy works at its foundation. Right now, we've had a lot of issues with companies because, like, in their very charter, their purpose is to maximize profit and return to shareholders. And there has been a big call for companies to acknowledge their social purpose, to recognize that they do owe things beyond shareholders to other stakeholders, to their workers, to the communities surrounding their operations. So when I'm talking about systems change, I'm really talking about the core purpose of business in our economy, the core ways that our economy functions and therefore impacts everyone's livelihood. So our vision as an organization is for that equitable economy that works for everyone. And I really do see like a system change where our economy would be promoting sustainability, promoting human health and human rights. I see that as the path forward to get there.
Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome. Glad to have you from Peru. Eleanor, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes. You spoke about renewable energies. So I'm presuming wind power, solar, and raise the question, who will benefit? And so you raised something for me that I never thought about, is in terms of respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. So many of these pipelines go through the BIPOC communities. How incongruous is it to have alternative energies disrupting the rights of indigenous, like how there are companies who do that? I mean, it never came to my mind. So it's a question, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Eleanor. I think that's also something when I first encountered it, I wouldn't think that renewable energy, this like climate solution that's really touted as like an industry of like our future, is something that could be associated with so many human rights violations. But studies have really shown that by and large, renewable energy projects are being sited in indigenous land. I think abroad, like globally, but also in the US. And as we know, there is not a lot of respect for indigenous rights baked into this country. So I think like Indigenous communities, just like our communities, are in favor of renewable energy, want to see that move forward. But I think the question of who will give consent to build those projects on their land, if it's built on someone's land, do they reap the benefits of that project, or is it just another form of extractivism? And I think a lot of people have been pointing to not only free, prior, and informed consent, so Indigenous people saying, yes, we consent to this project, or no, we don't, but also who's going to have ownership over those products. So actual ownership over the energy. And I think that goes a long way to autonomy, to respecting human rights. There is a really great report done by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center on renewable energy and Indigenous people's rights that I can link to in the chat, that really shows where a lot of companies, utility companies, especially renewable energy companies, are really failing to take into account Indigenous people's rights when they're trying to cite all these projects.
Thank you. Thank you.
Harry?
Yes, Jilliane, absolutely wonderful presentation and very helpful. I mean, a way I've never thought about it before is, I'm constantly telling people, use this company rather than that company. But they're all bad companies because the system is bad. That's the fundamental, that's the root issue. So we all tend to be very pragmatic people and want to know what to do. So what's the one single thing you would recommend to religious congregations in order to bring about this system change that you've talked about? I'm so struck by the words of Pope Francis, who said, as no leader of the world will, this economy kills. So what can we do? What's the single most effective thing we can do to address that?
Thanks, Terry. I think that is a great question. I would say as individuals, the number one thing we can do is vote, since that is our most clear avenue to systems change. As institutions, I feel like one of the most impactful thing we can do is just join a movement, whether it is shareholder advocacy, whether it is climate justice work, joining these movements that bring collective resources together, that bring people together and are demanding systems change. That is one of the most powerful things we can do. And I'm sure many of you are already knee deep in that work.
Thanks. Yeah, like Bill McKibben says, the best thing an individual can do is stop being an individual.
Yes, exactly.
Our friends from Peru, I think, have a comment or a question. Yes.
Identify. Okay. Eileen from Peru too. And my question is, Jillian, were you able to give any input to the commission that went to Scotland for the COP meeting? Was your association able to share with them your values and your commitment?
We have participated in some of the COPs before. I know when I was in university, I was able to attend the COP that was in Germany. I think we haven't been participating as strongly in this COP this year, but I think public policy is a huge part of our work. The Build Back Better, the Biden infrastructure bill is so critical to our international stance on climate. So we have been writing comment letters, been working with coalitions of other investors. I know that the religious climate space is very active around COP, so we absolutely support that movement. And interested to hear if anyone is doing work around COP, is participating in the protests, because I think that is where so much of this work intersects and comes to the forefront of the global community.
Thank you.
So that's a good point if anyone does want to say something about COP. But Jilliane, I was just thinking, there were several things from your talk. One definitely is the the whole idea of the environmental justice work that you're doing. And I thought I heard you say that it is a challenge to find partners in the community who are really experiencing the effects that the companies that we're investing in, or that the companies you're dialoguing with. And I'm just wondering if you want to say more to that, because I know you and I have had conversations about how we might connect through ROAR with some of the organizations and communities we worked with. But this might be a way that if we were more aware, we could be talking this up with people we know, or our colleagues that are actually in communities that are suffering with environmental justice issues. Why is this a challenge, and how? And that's one thing. And the other thing is, you just mentioned Build Back Better. And one of the things that, if I understand what's happening with Build Back Better, is we're really not requiring, requiring at this point companies, corporations, to like the payback polluters bill. It's not something that's favorable with Congress, that we do not want to hold companies and corporations accountable. And as you were saying, I think with what is it, carbon sequestration and carbon capture, that sometimes it just isn't fair. So I don't know if you would want to say something to those two issues.
Thanks, Carol. I think those are great things to point out. I would say first on the kind of policy side, I think you're absolutely correct. The Biden administration has really highlighted environmental justice as a priority, but as we've seen it play out, it is really not in favor with a lot of representatives, really not in favor with companies. But I will say that there has been unprecedented movement on environmental justice legislation, both on the statewide and federally. IASJ is based in New Jersey, and just this past year, they posted, I would say, one of the most robust environmental justice bills on cumulative impact. So companies have to take into account the cumulative impacts of pollution surrounding their facility when applying for new permits. So I think we're seeing unprecedented movement on environmental justice in the legislative space. But also to your comment about finding partners doing this work with accountability, you're absolutely right that it has been a challenge. I mentioned that investors, even though we are religious investors, that we're really motivated by our mission work. At the end of the day, we're still participants in the economy, and there's really a lack of trust between investors of, say, a mining company and the communities surrounding that company, whose livelihoods and health have really been devastated. So that has been a big barrier, but I think that this work is so interconnected, and many of our affiliate institutions, they are located all around the world. They are located in impacted communities. So there really is a need and a call to build those networks and build those relationships. Like I mentioned, we are working in so many different types of networks, of religious groups, of advocacy networks, to try to build those trusting relationships. But I would say overall, the network that I'm operating in is like vastly white, and there is not a lot of examples of really accountable relationships with BIPOC groups. And so as we're doing this work, I think it is very slow work and difficult work to build up these relationships in the right way, but I think doing it correctly is important. Like you said, Sister Carol, I think already exploring the networks that already exist, that we're already connected to, I think is one way that we can try to build up those relationships and bolster the work, because we don't want to be asking companies for things that we say are in alignment with those most impacted by climate change if we're not actually led by those who are most impacted by climate change. So I think that is a very important part of the work, and thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you. I'm wondering if it would be helpful we certainly can take more questions, but if anyone feels so moved in the chat to say what was helpful about this presentation, this discussion, or if you have additional questions, again, we're trying to build on, again, what are we called to? How do we feel moved to ecological conversion? So it always helps to have input. So there might be some people who haven't asked a question out loud or have an insight, but if you want to share in the chat, feel so moved. I'm just going to take a stab at this, Jilliane. The phrase circular economies really, really moved me. And I remember years ago, I was going back over some of my notes, 10, 15 years ago, I forget if it was in Sweden, and I forget the name, but the sustainability principles. And the doctor who was seeing so much cancer in children then began talking to the companies. I'm going to say it was Sweden, but I might be wrong on the company. On the country. But way back then, they were talking about the materials that were making the products and what were they contained, and then going through the cycle to then being recycled, out of when they couldn't be used anymore, how they could be recycled. And I said, wow, that's great. And not too many companies are doing that yet. Taking back the rugs or whatever they're making and then using them again. But I'm wondering if either you or anyone else has any good examples of circular economies, just to raise that up.
I can comment real quick, and anyone else I would love to have jump in. I think part of our work that I didn't touch on too much is in mission aligned investing. So like I said, making sure that people's actual investments, their portfolio are aligned with their mission, and that touches a lot on impact investing. So investing in a circular economy, investing in those climate solutions. And I have found through supporting that work and doing research in this work, that a lot of indigenous communities in the US, that's what I've had exposure to, are, I would say, like experts on investing in that circular economy. So looking at sustainable development, looking at what kind of tools and resources you use for construction and how that will serve a community 7 generations down the line. So I would definitely point to a lot of institutions that I've worked with on the indigenous investing side as really great examples about how to make that circular economy work. But interested to hear if anyone else has thoughts.
And thank you. I see people are putting a lot of Terry and Jilliane, some great resources in the chat. Any other thoughts on that?
I'm just going to put my foot in here for a moment, Carol. I'm someone who would need to have you say a little bit more about circular economy. Or Jilliane, I'm not familiar with that. Did you get that?
Yes, okay. I don't know, Jilliane, if you want to take a stab at just a simple definition of circular economy.
Yeah, I think a simple definition would be an economy that continues to serve itself. So a sustainable economy, an economy that continues to reuse and benefit from its resources. So kind of like the opposite of an extractive economy that creates a lot of waste.
Yeah, and I think, Eileen, thank you, because that's what I was thinking. We're talking a lot about extractive economy now, that we're taking and taking and taking, not just from the earth, from people, and of course from the earth. And how do we move from that extractive aspect to making it something that's not only sustainable, but life-giving.
Thank you.
And flourishing. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I put in the chat was an excellent resource from the Sisters of Mercy on extractivism. And it has a more general title, Awakening New Consciousness. So it's what's the alternative to extractivism? So it's a whole theological and analysis of systems process that has videos and reading materials. So the link is there. If anybody is interested in diving more deep into that, that would be a great resource.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to just give ourselves a moment just to just see if there's anything else before we kind of bring this to a conclusion. It's great. I mean, thank you, people from Peru. This is great, real international. Thank you for that. I am just wondering if anyone on this call is familiar with the Dominicans and what they did with the climate, the climate impact fund, I think. Jilliane, are you familiar with the
Leviticus Fund? I'm not very familiar with it, but
is that the Leviticus
No,
one?
no,
That's different.
Dominicans. She's talking.
Dominican.
The Dominican
Yes.
system. There are some Dominicans or were on, maybe they're more familiar.
Margaret
Margaret?
Anderson. Okay,
Yeah.
Margaret, you're good, because I would love to hear a little bit about that. I think that's worth celebrating, yes?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about it, not a lot, because I mean, I was involved in some of it. It came from a group that we have called an Earth Council, and it was a recommendation that we invest in anyway, what happened and to address climate, okay, with our investments. And after a lot of research, what happened was Morgan Stanley, and I believe this section of it is called BlackRock, has come up, and we've gathered almost all of the Dominican congregations of women in the United States began it. And there are two parts to it, and I'm not great on investing, but there's a public part and then there was a private part, which took longer because of all the rules and regulations about how that begins. But we now have it. It's got enough money to the private is what is different than most investments, the private fund, and they research companies that will receive investments, receive monies from the fund. It's international in the companies that they fund through this, but they are, and I would have to go back to materials, but it's companies that will have solutions to climate change, how we can change. And but there a lot of it is to help them to start up the companies. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. There are many investors now. The kickoff was a long time ago, but we couldn't say anything for almost a year after we had the kickoff in New York. But it is investments that in companies that will cause or support alternatives to the energy sources that we currently have and rely on. So it's an investment. As I said, most of the Dominican congregations of women are part of it. And it's, I don't know how many millions of dollars. I would have to look some of that up.
Right, and I'm wondering, Margaret, I can't quite remember. I'm wondering, I think, was it NCR did an article on it?
I put a link to the article in.
Oh, good. So I think this is worth
Okay.
also reading it. Yes, that's great, Terry. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if Reg McKellop is still on the call, but I believe she might know a little bit more than I did.
Yeah, I don't know. I know I saw her name before, but
She was on before, but she
Yes.
may have had to
Yeah.
leave.
But that's great, and I'm glad we have the link to that article, because I think, again, one of the things that I think is really very important about this is that sometimes those of us who are members of religious congregations, sometimes we don't even know what our congregation is doing in terms of investments. So it's important for us to be aware of this and to know this. So thank you very, very much. Yes. All righty, so I think that's it. I don't see any more questions. Jilliane, first of all, I want to thank Terry for being the kind of the instigator, the initiator for this series. Thank you, Terry, and getting us moving on this. Our next one, I don't know, Terry might want to make some concluding remarks. Our next one is the first Monday in December. But Jilliane, I just want to say thank you very, very much. I think you raised our awareness in certainly in so many ways, right? I see some people clapping hands. Thank you so very, very much, both in terms of what you're doing through IASJ, but also it is great to have your voice as a young adult. And hearing your perspectives. I know I need that. And I'm just great to the little ways we do kind of collaborate. I really appreciate that. So Terry, do you want to make any concluding remarks?
Yeah, just again to remind on Monday, December 6th, the Feast of St. Nicholas. We have great feast days so far on our talks. Will be our fourth talk on adoption of sustainable lifestyles, the fourth Laudato Si goal. And the presenter will be Carolyn Cromer, who works for the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, Kentucky, as the Director of Ecological Sustainability for that community. The Nazareth Charities have done tremendous things at their mother house in terms of sustainable lifestyles. So please come back and join us for that. If any of you, again, my email's in the chat. I will send to anyone who asks me, I'll send the link to Jillian's talk and also her PowerPoint if she'll send it to me, and the notes from the chat. So you'll have access to them. And also, since we're approaching halfway through the series, if any of you have any suggestions about like how the series has gone so far, if you'd like us to tweak the format, if you want a bathroom break in the middle or something like that, although you're free to take one on your own. So any suggestion you might have about the format of the series, if we can tweak it going forward, you can email me with that information too. So I will circulate the recording, but if you want the slides and the chat record, you'll have to email me to ask for it. Okay? So again, thank you to Jilliane. Thank you to all of you for this wonderfully stimulating and thought-provoking All Saints Day evening.
Thank you all. Hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks. Okay.
Thanks.
Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
night.